All right, guys, we're going to talk about Unit 4, Georgia, in the American Revolutionary Era, and we're going to start with the road to revolution. We're going to start talking about the French and Indian War and how it led to the American Revolution. So it says the French and Indian War changed the relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies in ways that neither side could foresee. As Great Britain tried to govern its larger territory, keep the Indians under control, and pay its debts, leaders developed what they called a new colonial policy. Most of the policy was not really new, but involved better enforcement of existing laws that had been ignored. So the colonists thought that after the French and Indian War, the relationship with Great Britain would go back to what it was before the war. We're the colonies, we're colonists, and Great Britain helps us in every way. We're not really paying taxes. Life is grand. That's going to change. So let's look at the French and Indian War. You have two sides, France and some Native American Indians, and then on the other side, Great Britain and most of the Native American Indians that were in agreement with Great Britain that basically these were trade agreements, and you were going to be on the side of who was going to benefit you in trade. So who won? Great Britain and most of the Indians. So what was the result of the French and Indian War? 1, France got kicked out. 2, of North America. 2, Spain got kicked out of the eastern part of North America. 3, British dominance in most of North America. And the Proclamation of 1763. So after the French and Indian War, the Americans became upset with the new British acts and began to respond with resistance. This caused Great Britain to pass other measures. By 1776, the colonies had determined to become their own country. Okay, so what were some effects of the French and Indian War? 1, the war had been expensive for Great Britain, and they already had serious debt. British citizens were weary of increasingly higher taxes. So the British government needed money and thought that Americans should be willing to pay for it and their continued defense in the colonies. Then they're going to pass something called the Navigation Acts. These were trade laws that had been loosely enforced or ignored for decades. One act required certain goods to be sold, rice, indigo, furs, at naval stores, to Britain. This meant that Georgia could sell directly to these products, that Georgia could not sell these products to France directly, that you had to use Great Britain. Another said that only British or colonial British ships could carry goods to colonial ports. This gave British merchants control of trade with the colonies. To avoid these acts, colonists resorted to smuggling, secretly importing or exporting goods. The third effect on the colony was the continued presence of British soldiers in the colonies. The British government did not recall all the soldiers, so many colonists thought that they were there to keep an eye on the colonists. Number 4. Another effect of the war was the removal of the French from Canada and the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the removal of the Spanish from Florida. So Georgia no longer had to fear Spanish schemes from east and west Florida or problems with the French along the Gulf Coast. So those first 3 things were very, very critical and important to the people who were ready to revolt. But this was one of the last straws, was the Proclamation of 1763. Late in 1763, King George III of England issued a proclamation prohibiting colonists from moving west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists who lived there had to move back east. They were not happy with that. Much of the land was given to Indians to avoid warfare with the settlers. So when we look at the Proclamation of 1763, it gave land to the west to British veterans of the French and Indian War and prevented any purchase of land from the Indians. But in spite of this proclamation, many frontiersmen moved westward into areas that are now Kentucky and Tennessee. So why issue the proclamation? What was the point of the proclamation? 1, again, to make peace with the Indians. 2, for fur trade. And 3, to build forts along the proclamation line. So what were some reactions to the proclamation? In Georgia, many colonists were not particularly angered by the proclamation because the colony was still a young colony, and many of its colonists lived along the coast. So that really didn't affect Georgia that much. Georgia's economy depended on trade with England, so living near the coast was an advantage. So colonists became angry. Well, let's go over here and look really quick. What did they become angry with? These 5 acts. Number 1, the Sugar Act. It placed a tax on imports from the Caribbean, including sugar. The Tea Act. Britain gave one company a monopoly on their favorite beverage. 3, the Stamp Act. A government stamp was needed for every official document. This increased the price of most goods in the colonies. The Intolerable Act. The British action that forced colonists to have soldiers in their homes and to feed them and house them. And it also closed the port of Boston. And then the Townshend Act, a tax on imported glass, paint, and tea. So colonists became angry. Colonists in America became increasingly independent in the 18th century. England had let the colonies manage their own affairs for many years, but began to assert more control in the 1760s and 1770s. The colonists did not like it. So England began to impose taxes such as the Stamp Act in 1765. Its purpose was to raise money needed to pay for the French and Indian War. It had been a very expensive war for England. So a little more on the Stamp Act. It required colonists to buy a government stamp for almost every paper document. Colonists rebelled, saying that Parliament should not tax them because they did not have a say in their government. This is where the term no taxation without representation comes from. They were upset. They were not being represented in government in England, so why should they pay taxes? So 2 major events that showed the colonist rebellion. Number 1, 1770, the Boston Massacre. British soldiers fired into the crowd and killed 5. And then the Boston Tea Party, colonists dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Again, what was Georgia's reaction? Georgia was the only colony to actually sell the hated stamps. Georgia was also the only colony in which the stamp master did not resign from his post. So you see that Georgia is kind of remaining loyal. Georgia's calmness had much to do with James Wright. He was loyal to the king and urged Georgians to remain loyal too. Many Georgians were still unhappy about the tax on paper goods, though. So James Wright refused to call Georgia's Common House into session to vote on the Stamp Act Congress. Georgia did not send any delegates to what was called the Stamp Act Congress. So the other colonies are going to get together, and they're going to do something called the First Continental Congress. They're going to meet in Philadelphia in 1774 with delegates from every colony except Georgia. Representatives from the 12 colonies wrote protests to England and decided to cut off trade with England until taxes and trade regulations were repealed. This is the effect of the First Continental Congress, is that the colonies cut off trade with England. Before a second Congress could meet, fighting broke out between the British and the Americans. King George III said that the colonies would not become independent without a fight. So the first armed conflict of the American Revolution took place at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts on April 19, 1775. After the war broke out, Georgia came on board. So the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1775. This time Georgia was represented. The Declaration of Independence is going to be written by Thomas Jefferson, and so we need to know what the different parts of the Declaration were. First of all, it was a list of reasons the colonists should become independent. The Declaration was adopted on July 4th, 1776. 3 Georgians signed the Declaration: Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton. So on July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. Again, Jefferson was the main author. One of the famous lines of the Declaration says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So the Declaration let the king know that the colonists were united against him and his taxes. Congress hoped to win the support of other foreign nations, since Britain had many enemies around the world. So again, let's look at the 3 different parts of the Declaration of Independence. We have the preamble, which explained the reasons for independence. You have the list of grievances. These were 27 complaints about how the king and parliament wronged the colonists. And you have the Declaration, which officially declared the colonies free from Great Britain, and it created, in a sense, the United States of America. So some more information. Examples of grievances: it did away with the colonial legislature, it kept armies even in times of peace, and it imposed unfair taxes. So the Declaration believed that you have natural God-given rights, and those rights do not come from the government. So let's look at our three signers. Button Gwinnett was born in England in 1735. He was a political leader. Really, the most famous thing about him is how he died. He dies in a duel with Lachlan Mackintosh, who was his political enemy. Yes, a duel, drawing guns and fired. Button Gwinnett got shot, and he will die from his injuries. Lyman Hall was born in Connecticut in 1724. He was a doctor. He helped with food and medicine during the Revolution. He's going to become a governor of Georgia. And then George Walton, born in Virginia, 1741. He was a carpenter, lawyer, farmer, Georgia governor, Georgia senator. It's a very important man also who signed the Declaration. Some dates that I want you to know. 1775 was the first battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts of the American Revolution. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. 1779, the fall of Sunbury, Augusta, and Savannah. 1780, the first battle for Augusta. 1782, the Patriots retake Savannah from the British. And by 1783, the Treaty of Paris, which will officially end the American Revolutionary War. And so officially, here we are, granted our independence. Although fighting had begun in Massachusetts in April 1775, months went by before there was actually fighting in Georgia. Georgia, 1777 Constitution. We're going to create the first 8 counties. It's going to create a legislature in Georgia. So while Georgia had been busy fighting each other and making unsuccessful raids in Florida, the American Patriot forces in the North had suffered several defeats and won very few victories. By October 1777, the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga in New York. This victory was good for the morale of the Patriots. It resulted in the Americans gaining a major ally in the war, France. So now France is on our side and fighting against the British in America. So we need to look at the battles of Georgia. The two main battles that we're going to look at is the Battle of Kettle Creek in February 14th, 1779, and the Battle of Savannah, on and off, starting in December 1778. So again, who were the Loyalists? The Loyalists were the people who stayed loyal to Great Britain and King George III. A patriot were the people who wanted independence from Great Britain. In the winter of 1778, British regiments began moving inland from the Georgia coast. Savannah fell to the British on December 29, 1778, and then Augusta would fall as well. So let's talk about two of the battles. The first battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of Kettle Creek. This takes place in kind of north central Georgia. In February 1779, the British commander in Augusta asked for reinforcements to capture the entire colony. Loyalist Colonel James Boyd answered the call, and he helped a group of 600 British troops and Loyalists to Augusta. After a long day of traveling, the group stopped and camped at Kettle Creek near present-day Washington, Georgia. After they finished breakfast, the British were attacked by a Patriot militia led by Elijah Clark and John Dooley. These two led their troops across Kettle Creek to surround the camp on the left and the right. Meanwhile, the third group, led by Andrew Pickens, attacked head-on. 350 British loyalists were captured. The surprise attack led to the Patriot victory and caused the British to withdraw from Augusta. The battle became known as the Battle of Kettle Creek, and it broke the British stronghold in Georgia. So victory for the Patriots. The other thing will not be a victory. The Siege of Savannah. The city of Savannah saw the largest battle during the American Revolution in the fall of 1779. The battle on October 9th, known as the Siege of Savannah, lasted only 90 minutes, but it led to the deaths of thousands of French and American soldiers. This battle was the second bloodiest battle of the entire war. Count Pulaski, a famous Polish soldier who had come to America to fight for freedom, died in a cavalry charge. After this American defeat, Georgia saw constant battles between the Patriots and the Loyalists. As the war goes on, we'll skip, and eventually by 1782, the British left Savannah. By 1783, again, the Treaty of Paris will grant America its freedom from England. So what are the dates of the American Revolution? A lot of people don't know that the American Revolution lasted for 8 years, from 1775 until 1783. So which battle did the Patriots win by surprising the enemy? That was the Battle of Kettle Creek. Which battle did the Patriots lose that was their second bloodiest battle in the war? That was the Siege of Savannah. Two more things we need to look at. The first thing is the Articles of Confederation. After declaring independence from Great Britain, the colonies had no national government. How would they govern themselves? So they're going to set up their first government of the United States. It'll be called the Articles of Confederation. So in 1777, representatives from the colonies worked together to form a government. The first plan was the Articles of Confederation. And by 1781, all of the 13 colonies, who were now states of the United States of America, had signed it. But it was weak. It was weak for a reason. The Articles established a loose association of the states with a weak national government. Why did they want it so weak? Because Americans were afraid to give their new government too much power. They had just fought a war to free themselves from a powerful government. So we're going to look at weaknesses of the article and the problems that they had. One, there was no strong national government. Well, the states had a lot of power but could not agree on a lot of things. No leader controlled the government. Well, someone needed to be in charge, correct? Congress could not establish a national army without permission from the states. Well, if you didn't have a national army, then how could you have somebody to protect you? The states did have local forces, but there was no army, navy, marines yet. Congress could not collect taxes. How could they raise money to run the government without taxes? Congress could make laws, but could not force the states to obey them. So laws were worthless if you could not enforce them. Each state had one vote, so population did not play a role. And then Congress could not make laws about trade. You needed consistent trade laws. So it soon became clear that the national government was too weak and they needed to be revised. They will revise them. That's something called the Constitutional Convention. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's look at your vocabulary. Articles of Confederation. It was the first Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1781, created a weak federal government, and was eventually replaced by the Constitution. There's going to be two men that are actually going to sign the Constitution from Georgia. One is Abraham Baldwin. He was a Georgia signer of the United States Constitution. He's the man also who created the University of Georgia. So what was the Constitution? The Constitution is a fundamental plan for operation for a government. Different people, just like we saw from earlier meetings, they are going to get together and they're going to create the Constitutional Convention, which I call CONCON. It was a meeting that created the United States Constitution, and it was in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Here's William Eview. He's also going to be a Georgia signer of the United States Constitution. So let's talk about the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is where the states agreed on two things. Remember, we were talking about equal representation or population. So the states agreed that the House of Representatives would be based on population and that the Senate would have equal representation. This created a two-chambered Congress. The House of Representatives based on population and the Senate based on equal representation. The 3/5 Compromise was for population purposes that all slaves would count as 3/5 of a human. Now you have to think, why would the northern states want only a slave to count for 3/5 of a human? The slaves were in the South, and it would have given the South more power if they had a stronger population. So citizens in the North said, well, we don't want places like Virginia and South Carolina and North Carolina and Georgia to have more power than us. So they instituted the 3/5 Compromise. It did away with the unicameral legislature, which is a one-chambered legislature. Okay? So this is what you need to know for your test. I know it's a lot. Listen to this again if you need to. It's on YouTube. Do your best with it. We're going to do some practice questions and some studying today and tomorrow to get us prepared for your test on Wednesday.